We are live. Hello and welcome to the My Veteran Experience podcast, where veterans and military family members speak about their experiences in and around the military and how it's impacted or impacts what they do today. And real honored and excited to have Diane Boettcher with me today. And welcome, Diane.
Thanks, Joe. Excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So I asked this question of everybody. So what do you want people to know about you?
Yeah. So, gosh, the two main things I think people need to know about me is first, I consider myself one of the first digital natives. Both my parents worked for a computer firm as I was growing up, and Mr. Norris, who was the CEO, thought
You said
computers were
digital. What was the word you used?
digital
Digital.
native. A
Native. Okay,
digital
got it.
native.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So I grew up in technology. The CEO of the company thought computers were going to change the world and that they actually belonged in the home, which was a radical idea, in the late 70s, early 80s. And so he found employees who had young children and he gave us a mainframe terminal. So we had a mainframe terminal in my basement with an old 300 baud acoustical modem, and we used to stay up all night playing games and, chatting with boys, and because that's what you do online, right? You play games and you meet people. And
Right on.
so that was a pretty formative experience. So I feel very comfortable with technology, and I always like to kind of find the next new technology. And the other thing is, I've spent most of my adult life living outside of the continental United States. And so first in the Navy and then as a civilian contractor and now with Microsoft, I've lived in Guam, Hawaii, Spain, Germany, Afghanistan, although obviously my family wasn't with me, and now in Singapore. So.
Well, awesome. So there's a lot. That's a lot to dig into. So digital native. I've never heard that phrase or
Yeah.
term. So it's kind of cool. So you've lived, and been all over the world in the Navy, and then looks like with your career as well. So let's do this. So where did you grow up? Like where, geographically, and then and you are digital native, so that probably drew you to the career you're in today, being in technology. So growing up, and then how did you end up, in the Navy first, and then now in your career, how did that, kind of give us the journey there?
Yeah, thanks. So I was actually born in Alabama. My dad sold computers to NASA. So I was born in Huntsville, Alabama, and then we lived in Orlando. And then when the space program kind of wrapped up, we moved to Minnesota, which is where my mom is from. And so I spent most of my, up through high school in Minnesota, which was, a great place to grow up. And it's really not sure why, but I really just got I joined Reagan's Navy, I always say, right? So it was a time where, it was just lots of patriotism, and I felt so blessed. I felt so much that the country had given me so much. And the least I could do was to, help and do my part of the task, as others have said. So when it came time to go to graduate from high school, I said, I want to join the Navy. And my dad, I didn't know it at the time, but my dad had always wanted to join the Navy. And his initial reaction was, why would you want to do that? That was like the first thing. And then he said, well, if you're going to go, Diane, he said, go to college first, go in, be an officer. Yeah. And so I took that route. I went to Marquette University. I went through ROTC.
Oh, wow.
And then, I'm kind of always up for a challenge, right? Always seeking the novel. And so at the time, women were not allowed in combat. This was, again, mid to late 80s. And so there weren't that many women in flight school. There were only, actually, they only took 4 women as NFO students every year.
So real quick, so were you from the Twin Cities in Minnesota? Were you
Yeah,
from
oh
Twin
yeah,
Cities?
just yeah,
Got it.
a
Okay.
suburb of a
Okay.
suburb of
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Great.
yeah,
Yeah. The reason I asked, my wife's family's from Minneapolis, so
yeah,
I know
yeah,
the area.
yeah,
Okay. Go ahead.
yeah,
You're
yeah, yeah.
Marquette.
So
You're
I'm Marquette. I'm trying to decide like what do I want to do in the Navy, right? So they were just starting to open up some of the ships, and then there was a few women who got to go be naval flight officers, and I, you know, couldn't see. You know, I didn't have the 2020 vision to be a pilot. So I was like, you know what? They're like, well, it's really hard. You know, they don't take many people. And I was like, I'm in. You know, like, that's what I want, the challenge. And so, yeah, so I went to flight school and that was, it was challenging. But it was also a lot of fun. It was, you know, just something different every day, right? You know, different flights, different, yeah, it wasn't the desk job, wasn't the, you know, kind of, you know, got to do a lot of fun things. So um, yeah. So what was the other part of the question? How do I
Yeah.
get
So
into?
what was your first? So you finished flight school, and
Yep.
where did you go? I mean, what were you
Um,
flying, and
yeah.
where were you stationed? And
Yeah. So again, not too many options, but I went to VQ1 in Guam. And so, yeah, that was my first time in the Pacific. So we were based in Guam, but we forward deployed to, you know, Japan, Okinawa, uh, the Philippines, Korea, Singapore. I first came to Singapore in
wow.
1992.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it was, and just, so I flew reconnaissance aircraft. So if you remember the plane that landed in China?
So my father
Like,
was in VQ2 and rode a Spain when I was little.
oh,
So
really?
I'm very familiar with it. My
Oh
father was
my
enlisted, and he was an air crewman in the old A3, and
gosh.
so very familiar with VQ.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So that was my squadron.
All
I did
right.
that for a few years and then um, I met my husband in Guam. He was at Marine Corps Barracks, Guam. And then we moved to Hawaii and I was with SINCPAC back when they were Sinks. Now it's Indo-PACOM, I guess. And yeah, lived in Hawaii for a few years and then went to Spain and then back to the States. And I came off active duty in the States right after Y2K.
So in
So,
Hawaii, were you in a VP squadron in Hawaii,
no, I was
or you're at
actually,
PACOM? You were at PACOM
yeah, I
at
was at
St.
PACOM. Yeah,
Okay.
I was, I did emergency actions
Oh,
for
okay.
people who know what
And
that
your
might be.
husband is a Marine.
My husband's a retired Marine. Yep.
Okay.
He actually retired while we were in Hawaii.
Okay.
And yeah, yeah,
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
Yeah, so one thing on the VQ, just because I'm familiar with it, like I
Yeah.
said, I was born and rode to Spain. My dad's first assignment, my mother is from Spain, from that part of
Yeah.
Spain. But interesting stuff in VQ. I mean,
Yes.
VQ's out there getting lit up and by fire control systems and radar systems. And you were the mission commander, or that's kind of
Yeah.
that's the
Tacky.
role, the attack, yeah, that you go
Tacky eval.
into.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, and you know what was interesting? It was such an interesting time because the Navy had just changed the definition of combat, right? So the congressional law said women weren't allowed in combat, but each service got to determine what combat meant. And so they had just changed the definition from seek out, recruiter, or engage the enemy
Mhm.
to seek out, recruiter, and engage the enemy. And because the EP3 has no weapons and we were completely defenseless, it was okay for women to be on board,
Yeah,
which is
interesting.
kind of an interesting, like, I'm not sure
Well,
the
I
logical
mean,
consistency there,
yeah,
but
and you said something earlier. You said something earlier about coming in the Reagan era, and I
yeah.
came in during that same time, and I kind of joke with the current veterans today is that we won the Cold War, so we were actually out there winning the Cold War during those years,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
so yeah, so that was the time I came in. So you spent that time active service. What
Yeah.
as you transitioned, how was that, and what did kind of
Uh,
you know, how was that experience?
so Great question. So, yeah, so transitioning out kind of like that mid-early career, it was scary. I was scared. I didn't know what I didn't know what I was worth. I didn't know how much salary to ask for. I didn't know what I was going to be able to do. It was, so I followed the money. I'll be honest. I took the first job I got offered that was just a ton of bank. And I
Show me
was
the
like,
money.
show me the money. Because I was scared. I was like, how am I going to pay my bills, right?
Yeah.
And I was deeply unhappy. It was a terrible choice
Was it in
to just follow.
technology?
Well, it
Okay.
was in technology sales
Okay.
is where it
Yeah. Okay.
was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And my boss lied to me, which I didn't know people did, right? Like, I mean, because in the Navy, they'd be like, this is terrible, but they'd be honest
Right.
with
Right.
you about it
Yeah.
being
Right. Right.
terrible.
Right.
Like, they wouldn't hide it, and they would
You've
just, "Mm,
got you've
it's,
got duty from 2 to 4 a.m. It
yeah,
hurt. It sucks, but we're not lying
yeah,
to you.
suck it up, right?" And so I was so shocked to find out that somebody would lie to me. And so I ended up leaving that role and kind of following my passion, right? Which was I like to code. I was doing a lot of webmastering. That was the early days of the internet. I actually learned HTML 1.0
All right. Pioneer.
back in the day. Yeah, tables were a big. Oh my gosh. Um, yeah, so I took a job being a webmaster for a healthcare IT firm.
Where
So it
did you
was kind of
go?
outside. We were living in DC at the
Okay.
time,
Okay.
so it was in Maryland, and I loved it. I remember coming home like a month or two into it, just telling my husband, I've got to find a new hobby because like, I mean, I used to come home from work and work on different web pages, and now I was able to do that during the day. It was
Well, let me
fantastic.
ask you this. So I had another podcast with a lady that got into software development from,
Mhm.
out of college as well, probably around the same time frame you did. Was it very male dominated?
Yeah. But I mean, having gone to flight school in the
Yeah, you were in
90s,
the Navy,
right?
so a little
Like,
bit
it's
different.
just like,
This lady was not in the military,
yeah,
so a little different
yeah,
experience. You already come out of a very um,
yeah.
uh,
But
male majority.
yeah, I did find though that I did find women community though. Like, so there's actually a still very active group called DC Web Women.
Mm,
And it started out as mailing list and then morphed into workshops and networking events and all these kinds of things. And it was just wonderful to be able to, at least occasionally walk into a room
mhm.
surrounded by other women who love technology. And I found that having that community was
Yeah.
really, it's really inspiring, right? To see other people who look like you doing what you do, you know, it's
Now,
cool.
was your webmaster work, was there a particular focus to it? Like, what were you
Um,
supporting?
yeah, so the firm that I worked for was a small firm that had carved out a niche in HIPAA. HIPAA had just been signed, and it was so they had kind of doubled down on being a privacy and security IT consulting firm. So we would help both like big, institutional, hospital systems, right,
Hmm.
with thousands of doctors and healthcare professionals figure out how to implement a HIPAA policy all the way to, a one doctor, you know, strip mall office. Like,
Mm,
how are they doing it? How's the dentist doing HIPAA? How's this
mm.
general practitioner doing HIPAA? And we scale different offerings, and that was and the main website I ran was all about HIPAA privacy. It was all
Mm.
about how to implement HIPAA. And that was a lot of fun. And I will tell you, it was just a weird moment. We had we had thousands of people subscribing to our newsletter, and every quarter we would run a survey, like how are you doing? What challenges do you have? These kinds of things. And we actually got quoted in the congressional record, our
Wow.
survey. which was really cool.
Well, I know a little bit about you, so I know you stayed in the reserves, right?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did that go? Because I was a reservist as well. So how did being a reservist and working full-time webmaster and how did those two, how did that play for you and
Yeah.
your family?
Yeah. So the healthcare IT firm that I was working for was so small that they actually wrote their military leave policy for me.
Okay.
I was like, I'm getting ready to go on military leave, and they're like, "Oh, well, what do we do?" And so I kind of helped them navigate that, and they updated their handbook with a military leave policy for
All
me,
right.
um, which was cool. And after a while, though, I ended up shifting, and I got into defense contracting and working with companies. And actually, what ended up happening for me, and it turned out to be really just a real boon to my career, actually, because there was probably for the first 5 years, after at the end of every AT, so I'd go on AT for 2 weeks, right? And I got into units that were doing IT. So I did get this really great Venn diagram of like what I was doing for the Navy and what I was doing for my civilian job. And I would go do a 2 week AT, and at the end of the 2 week AT, they'd be like, Diane, we'd like to hire you as a contractor. So it was almost like a 2 week job interview, like
There
everywhere
you
I
go.
went.
Nice.
And so, yeah, it turned out just, and and Joe, the caliber of the people that you get to work with in the reserves is just really phenomenal.
Oh yeah.
So not only did I get job offers, I gave job offers, right?
Mm.
Like I hired people I had met and worked with in the Navy, and I knew their work ethic, and I knew their talents, and I knew what they were capable of. And it became very easy to, when an opening would happen in my civilian job, to say, oh, I know somebody, let me give Dave a call, let me give Mike a call, let me give Sarah a call, and we can bring them into the company, and I can vouch for them because I've seen their work. And so
Well,
that was really cool.
yeah, let me say something real quick. So, I have a close friend. She actually introduced me to my wife, and she is a Navy reservist. And soon after meeting you, which has been a couple years ago at least, I was having a conversation with her, and I mentioned your name, and she's like, "Oh, I know Diane. She's like a mentor to me and a lot of other women in our community." And I thought that was such a small world. So she had great things to say about
Oh,
you,
that's so cool. Yeah.
and it was, I think you know who I'm talking about, Kathy Boner.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna say,
that was kind of a cool story because I didn't,
yeah,
talk about a small world.
indeed, indeed. Yeah.
So you got into defense contracting, and then how did
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
how was that? Or did it open up like a whole new world, or did you purposefully seek it out, or just kind of like, hey, I'm kind of go ahead.
Yeah, I did seek it out because what had ended up happening at the healthcare IT firm that I was working for, although I loved it, it was great. They were really supportive. At at some point, I realized that I was not going to be able to advance in my career there because they were looking for somebody with a healthcare background, and I didn't have that. And so it was actually following one of my ATs. A group of people said, "Hey, we'd like you to come in as a contractor." And actually, at the time, I said, now's not the right time. But then, like 6 months later, when I kind of had this epiphany that without the background, I wasn't going to be able to realize my career aspirations. I called them up and I said, "Are you still interested?" And because I do have a defense background, right?
Mhm.
So I came into the defense contractor, and what I found, kind of to your earlier question, like how does that work? How do you navigate the reserves and a civilian career? And I think the only way to do both successfully is to find ways to get those two twofers, like to do the things that both careers value, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm trying to have two completely separate careers where there's no overlap, I don't think you see your family.
Right.
Or sleep or
Yeah.
whatever. Like, so you have to find those things, whether it's, getting a Lean Six Sigma certification or a PMP or a leadership course or something like that. And then I would always come back after my ATs or even my drill weekends, and I would say, hey, I learned about this. So I'd bring that into my civilian career to say, to show my employer how much, what a good deal they were getting, right? Because, the
Right.
Navy
Right.
invested,
Yeah.
in this training for me, or, whatever. So,
And where did you
yeah.
go for your drill? Where were you going?
Yeah, so all over the place, right?
Norfolk,
So,
or were you going to
you know,
Norfolk, or?
yeah, so when I started out, I was actually drilling with NAVCOM Telcom, which, the Navy loves their acronyms. NAVCOM Telcom, the Navy Computer and Telecommunications Command,
Uh-huh.
which was actually right at Nebraska Avenue, where Department of Homeland now sits.
Okay.
Um, and so I was at NAVCOM Telcom, and then went to Norfolk, went to NICTAMS. That was my first command.
Big
I commanded,
Tams.
yeah, Navy Computer Telecommunications
Vacation.
Master
Master Station.
Station.
Yeah. There's several of those masters out there.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I was NICTAM, and then I was in Spay War, and did some other places. So I kind of bounced between the NICTAMS folks, Spay War, and the Office of Naval Research. And so, and then, oh gosh, right about the time I promoted to captain, the Information Dominance Corps stood up in the Navy, which brought together Intel, CRIPPs, IPs, which is my background, and the METOC communities. And
Okay.
so I started doing some different work with them. So yeah.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. So I kind of alluded to it earlier about, you know, the tech industry that you're in, and is male dominated. Let's just, or
Hmm.
male majority. I don't know if dominated is the right word, but male majorities.
Yep.
And there's always and I've been, and full transparency, we work at the same company, and we'll get to
Yep.
that. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But there's always like, hey, we need more women in tech. We're
Mm.
recruiting
Yep.
our university teams out to colleges, and whatever all those efforts are, and there's a lot of efforts. I mean, there's a lot of investment and attention to it. What are your thoughts on maybe why more women maybe don't pursue tech careers, or
Hmm.
are not coming into tech careers? I don't know maybe
Yeah.
the right phrase to use, but kind of your thoughts on that.
So I've been a strong advocate for women in tech, right? And what's fascinating to me is it's actually getting worse, right? Like,
Oh,
I
that's
mean,
good.
there's unfortunately, if you look back in the 60s and the 70s, there's actually a really fun article that ran in Cosmo magazine in like
One of my
1967.
favorites.
Yeah. and they quoted Admiral Hopper. Admiral Hopper
Yeah.
talks about how computers are a great career for women. And the early pioneers in software engineering. In fact, Margaret Hamilton coined the term software engineering,
Mhm.
right? Because she's the one who wrote the code for Apollo.
Mhm.
And the men were like, well, we're doing all the great hardware engineering, and she goes, well, I'm doing the software engineering. And so she coined that phrase. um, so it's so over the years, I mean, there's a lot of theories about it. Some people say that they started marketing computers as boy toys, and
Mm.
that and that's why girls were not exposed to it early. So the computers that came into the home ended up in the boys' bedrooms as toys
Mm.
for them rather than as family
Okay.
assets where everybody had equal access to them. That's one of the theories. I don't know that anybody's really sure. I can tell you that it's it's not going to get better without us being very deliberate about it, right? And finding the ways to show the younger women in tech that there is a career path for them, right? And so that's why I believe it's critical. I think representation is so important, and that when we have opportunities to, you know, to put people on stage or send people to conferences or to do these things, that we include, women's voices in it, because then the young women, they look around and they go, oh, there is a place for me, right? I do belong here, So I think that's, I think it's awfully complicated. There is that, there's that vicious cycle, right? When there isn't a lot of women, it becomes hostile to women, then women leave. Then there are women, it's hostile, and so we have to switch. We have to switch the narrative, right? We have to switch the narrative. We have to be deliberately welcoming, and they say, if you're not being deliberately inclusive, you're being, unintentionally exclusive. And so I think there has to be energy against it.
Yeah, and I think having role models and mentors, because when you're young and impressionable, you kind of, these figures who are role models can kind of go, hey, I want to grow up to be like that person or whatever. And I don't really, I mean, I can't say I really understand or know what's going on in high schools and universities today that either make a difference or don't. So you say it's getting worse, and why and how?
Yeah, numerically, yeah. If you run the numbers, women are the number of computer science degrees for women is slightly increasing, but when you look at the longevity, like 5 years after graduation, who is still in the industry, women are leaving the industry. So, which is kind of sad. I do think, I will tell you this. So funny story. One of the people I got an opportunity to work with in ONR is a captain. You may know her, Kay Heyer. So Navy captain, P-3 pilot, one of the first women to fly in combat, and an astronaut.
Wow.
And so I worked with her when my kids were little. And so, I had, she'd give us signed pictures of her, and, and I would talk about my friend Kay, the astronaut. And I realized I may have overdone it at one point when my son said, Mom, boys can be astronauts too. And I told Kay that story, and she laughed.
Go forth, young man.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I was fortunate to be able to listen or be at a speech by Grace Hopper, Admiral Grace Hopper. I listened to her, or I was in the audience at least twice that I remember during my time as a midshipman. She would come in uniform and would give the wire she would hold up.
The nanosecond.
Yeah, the nanosecond. It was the nanosecond speech. That was kind of cool. And now to see the building. I mean, I went to the Naval Academy to see the Grace Hopper building, cyber building going up. It's kind of cool. So
cool.
Yeah. So you've been in technology, I'll just say a couple years. You've been working in the tech industry for a couple years. And so you're kind of in the defense industry, and you maybe sort of still are to some extent. So continue that journey of like kind of, you don't have to say company names if you don't want, but I mean, who, kind of who have you worked for and where are you now, and how has it been?
Yeah. Okay. So I think, when I left the healthcare IT, I went into defense contracting and spent a couple of different, with a couple of different companies, right? Because, to some extent as a defense contractor, you swatch out the badge, but not the lanyard, right? That's what we say. It's like you support the same agency, but you just swap out your corporate badge. And then I had an opportunity, this was it was the fall of 2006. I got a phone call. I was commanding in the Navy Reserve, and I got a phone call from the Reserve Center. And they said, hey, Commander Boettcher, please give us a call back. And so I called him back, and the guy says, let me find your file. I was like, I'm getting mobilized. And sure enough, the next thing he says is, you're now subject to the UCMJ. You are under orders. I was like, wow, okay, good to know. And back then, they didn't necessarily give us, like now they have rules about how much like lead time they have to give you. But back then, it was like
Right.
you have to report in 3 weeks.
Wow.
And so then I get off the phone and I have to go in and tell my boss I've been mobilized. She took it really well, really supportive. And so that's when I spent some time in Norfolk, some time in Afghanistan. And then, came back into the job. And about a year after that, that's when I had an opportunity to go to Germany and help run the network for the brand new U.S. Africa Command,
Oh, yeah.
which was, lots of fun. So did that, got to spend some time on the continent. I kept drilling, actually. I drilled in Naples, which was just, fantastic because I love the food. So go
Well,
to Naples.
I was mobilized and went to Stuttgart, so
Yeah,
I
there
share
you
that with
go.
you.
Boy, we have a lot of this, a lot of the, what do they say, a lot of the same mud on our boots, don't we?
Exactly, exactly.
So so came back from Germany, worked in the Pentagon for a couple of years, and I know some people like have different feelings about the Pentagon. I always thought it was an honor to work there. Walking, actually, my walk from the metro to my office took me by the press corps and then by the chairman's
Mhm.
office. And it was just always, I was always humbled by that. I was always humbled by the ability to kind of continue to serve even as a contractor. And then we moved to Tampa. Just, we lost the contract that I was running. So I was the program manager, and the leadership always gets fired, right? Everybody else gets to swap out badges. The leadership
Have a nice day.
has to move along. So I did. And
Okay.
and so we decided to move down to Tampa and did that for a couple years. And then somebody I knew from the Navy, which is here's something interesting about the move to Tampa, though. And I only found out about it after I
Now
got the
you moved
job.
to Tampa
Right?
just to move to Tampa. It wasn't for a position.
I did get a new job. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Got
yeah.
it.
So I have family in Tampa as well.
Okay.
So
I love
we
Tampa.
yeah, yeah. So it was like on our list, and so I found a role in Tampa, and I put in for it. It was a different company, and I only found out after I got the job. This is the funny thing is, I when I like came on board, my boss says, "So you know Jan Hamby?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I know Admiral Jan Hamby." And
Mhm,
he's like, "Yeah, I went to school with her husband."
mhm.
And so he had gone on to LinkedIn when he got my application. He'd gone on to LinkedIn, figured out who we both knew, figured out I knew Admiral Hamby, called her up and said, "What do you think about Diane?" Like, I didn't even know this happened. And so it was like I still got that job because of my military. I mean, like it's like
Your
continues to echo.
file. Yeah, I think they got your
Yeah.
file again, right?
I was like, wow, I have to send her, send her a bottle of wine, helping me land the role. So yeah, I did that for a couple of years, and then somebody else I knew in the Navy called me up and said there was a position at Microsoft, and would I be interested? And here's the thing is, he'd actually been after me for a while to join Microsoft, and I wasn't all that interested. And then when he called me this last time, I had just read an article about Satya Nadella and about what
Mm.
he was doing at Microsoft. Satya had been the CEO for a little over a year, and I was inspired by him. I mean, it sounds
Cool.
cheesy, but that's
Yeah.
that's why I said yes and
Well, I imagine
interviewed with
I might know this person, but we don't have to
you.
mention who it is.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was, and so I've been at Microsoft now. My 5-year anniversary was on
Wow.
Monday. So
Awesome.
and I've been initially supporting the Department of Defense, right? So it was my experience working with different combatant commands that brought me into that role. So where I was, kind of running that part of the business, and then there were some changes in the organization, and I shifted, but I continued to support mostly cleared customers, mostly our customers who require clearances. And did that for a couple of years, and then an opportunity came up in Singapore. And like I said, I'd first gotten to Singapore in 1992, and I was just blown away by, the diverse culture, the food,
Yeah.
just
Awesome.
just Asia in general. So yeah, so I was invited to apply for a role in Singapore, and I've been doing that now for a couple of years. So
Wow.
it's been an amazing journey. What's been interesting though, and this I'll share with you, so when I first joined Microsoft, and most of my jobs up to that point, I had been working with other veterans, right?
Yeah.
People who knew what a Navy captain was, right? They understood what that meant, right? Or what it kind of like, what at least had an understanding of what my experiences had been.
Hmm.
And then when one of the reorgs happened, I landed in an organization where my boss was not a U.S. citizen, right? So not
Hmm.
only didn't have a clearance, he was completely ineligible. My peers, one of my peers, I was the only person she has ever met who served in the Navy.
Wow.
And I was like, everybody I know. like, how do you not know
Right.
us? Like,
Exactly.
there's
Your
so
whole
many
your
of
whole
us.
community is.
And it was funny because she couldn't understand half the things I said, right? Like I'd text her, hey, I'm running late. I'll send up a flare when I'm inbound. She's like, what are you even,
I
do
served at
what?
Nick Tam's. So like, what's Nick Tam?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And
But a great
she,
exp- but I imagine a great experience in Singapore.
oh gosh, yeah. Yeah. And actually I have a regional role. So I've gotten to go to,
Wow.
Vietnam, Korea, Philippines again, right? Some of my old stomping grounds,
Huh.
Malaysia, Indonesia, New Zealand. Yeah, it's just and then also I have peers in China, which is really cognitively interesting for somebody who
Mm,
served for 30 years,
right.
right? Is seeing is working with somebody who's lives in Beijing and is a Chinese citizen, and it's just a different it's a different experience being around, not only not people who aren't veterans, but people who aren't Americans, right?
Sure.
And their understanding of what I did in the Navy. I mean, it completely freaks them out, right? Like I was talking to a peer of mine from Thailand, and I mentioned I forget how it came up, but I said, I was in Afghanistan, and she said, well, what did you do there? And I said, well, I was an operational planner. And she said, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, I planned military operations. And she looked horrified. I mean, the look on her face. And I was like,
Right.
I wanted to like pat her on the hand and say, it's okay, right? Like you're safe. Like it
Right.
was, really,
Yeah.
it was a fascinating experience.
Yeah. I mean, I would think even in the U.S., a segment of our own population would probably kind of look at you and go, "Really?" And then to be overseas, even more
Yeah.
so. Especially working in a company, you're at Microsoft now, where
Yeah.
and I have a family that live in a different country, and when you speak to them about military, first of all, I think they think that people just serve their whole life. It's not like you go in for 4 years and you get out.
Uh,
It's like if
yeah.
you do military, it's sort of your life, your career. But so cool. And I'll just say, I work at Microsoft, and I met Diane. I met you probably 3, 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and invited you to speak, and we'll get to that here in a second. So you're leaving Singapore to a different role now, and so
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of summarize a few things. So you're a digital native, which is kind of cool. I love that phrase. So you grew up already exposed to technology and interested in it, and your father gave you seemingly great advice. Go to college and then join the Navy and do that route, which was great. You got to fly in P-3 aircraft. So a couple of shared experience. I mean, I'm very, like I said,
Yeah.
VQ is something I'm very familiar with, and we were both in Stuttgart. We have the
Yeah.
same mud in our boots, the same beer in our veins, and not to
Indeed.
assume that you're a beer drinker, but I
Uh,
don't know.
it's a safe assumption.
Okay, the safe assumption, and we have some friends, and I'll just say a theme that I kind of take away from listening to you is that over your career, people have seeked you out. So your AT time, your how you got to Microsoft, you knew Admiral Hamby, people were like, hey, there's Diane. Let's kind of see what she's up to and see if she's interested in this opportunity, which is a great thing. It speaks volumes of you. And so I've heard you speak. As I said earlier, I invited you to be on a panel, and I think I called it "Women at Microsoft." I think was
Yeah.
or women veterans. It was women veterans at Microsoft.
Yeah, that's right. We were all veterans.
It was all veterans. It was probably 5 or 6 individuals, and I thought it was a great panel.
Yeah.
I thought everybody had their own unique story and advice. So the my veteran experience is about transitions and your military experience as well. So as we kind of look to wrap up here, what's your advice and what are your thoughts and what would you like to impart on somebody who's either active duty and getting ready to transition, or someone who's in a company now or a career and may want to transition to something else?
Okay. Oh, based on my experience, right, where when I got out, I followed the money, and and that didn't work out, and then I followed my heart, and then that did, right, and so that would be my advice, right. What I find a lot of veterans struggle with is discerning what they want to do. They're perhaps like me, they're afraid, right? And they don't know what they can do that they'll get paid for. And so sometimes when I'm mentoring veterans or folks who are transitioning, I'll ask them, what do you want to do? And they'll say, well, I want to get a job. Well, yeah. I mean, obviously you have to buy Pop-Tarts for the kids, right? I get that, right? You can't. But what do you want to do? Like, what do you want to? What do you want to do when you wake up in the morning and you're excited to go to work? What does that feel like? Like, what is it that you're going to go do that you're going to be excited about getting to go do? And then figure out who will pay you to do that, right? So start with what do you enjoy, and then figure out who pays for that, right? Rather than just starting with what can I get paid to do? Because most veterans have a pretty big universe of things that they're good at, right? Because that's like our whole career in the military. Like, we get thrown in new situations and you're like, okay, can I talk to somebody who did this job before? Nope, they PCS. No, you're on your own. Okay, and you just dig in and you learn it. So I think most veterans can do just this huge universe of things. So rather than focusing on what can I get paid for, focus on what do you enjoy doing, and success will come if you do that.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, it's been an honor and exciting to learn a little bit more about you. Like I said, I know some things about you, but it's cool to hear the journey. And I'll file away the digital native title, which is pretty cool.
Thanks.
And when you get back to the U.S., I'm sure I'll see you. And just for everybody to know,
Looking forward
the bookshelves are empty because Diane is on her way to move back to the United States. So they're in the process of moving. So, well, great. Well, thank you very much, Diane.
Thanks,
it's been a
Jeff.
pleasure, and
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and hope to see you soon.
I hope so too.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.